James Reynolds woke up to an unsettling sight outside his suburban home. Overnight, 5 massive shipping containers had appeared, stretching across his driveway and completely blocking access to his garage. The towering steel structures, each the size of a small apartment, loomed over his otherwise picturesque neighborhood. James stared in disbelief. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an outright violation of common sense. He couldn't move his car, he couldn't leave for work, and worst of all, the containers looked as though they had been placed there with deliberate intent. As he stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, he inspected the thick metal doors, each one secured with industrial-grade padlocks. They were unmarked, no logos, no shipping labels, nothing to indicate where they had come from or why they were there. Neighbors were already peeking from their windows, some stepping out onto their porches to gawk at the bizarre blockade. James knew immediately that this was no accident. Someone had orchestrated this. And in this neighborhood, there was only one group with the audacity to pull a stunt like this. It didn't take long for James's suspicions to be confirmed. Diane Whitmore, the ever-smug president of the Homeowners Association, arrived with an air of forced politeness, accompanied by Richard and Karen, her 2 most loyal board members. Diane adjusted her pearl necklace and gestured at the containers as if they were some grand architectural addition rather than an act of blatant obstruction. "Good morning, James," she said in that condescending tone she reserved for people she considered beneath her. "I see you've noticed our new project. These containers are part of the Community Improvement Initiative." James clenched his jaw. "Community improvement? You dumped 5 shipping containers in my driveway, Diane." She flashed a rehearsed smile. "The board has been discussing ways to optimize space utilization, and we found a creative solution." Richard, a man who took HOA regulations as gospel, stepped forward with a clipboard. "According to Article 14, Section B of the HOA Charter," he began, flipping through pages, "the board has the authority to utilize community spaces for projects deemed beneficial to the neighborhood." James let out a sharp laugh. "My driveway isn't a community space, and this is illegal." Diane's expression didn't waver. "You're welcome to file a formal complaint," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. James had dealt with the HOA's nonsense before, but this was James wasn't new to the HOA's antics. For months, he had been the target of their relentless harassment, petty fines, absurd citations, and increasingly bizarre rule enforcement. His mailbox, according to Diane, was the wrong shade of navy. His garden gnome, which had stood peacefully beside his rose bushes for years, was apparently a half-inch taller than regulation allowed. Then there was the incident with his trash cans. The HOA had fined him $50 because they claimed his bins had been left out too early for pickup, despite the fact that the garbage truck arrived at dawn. It was clear that James had been singled out, and he knew why. He refused to bow to their authority. Unlike his more compliant neighbors, he didn't believe the HOA had the right to dictate every aspect of his property. While most residents begrudgingly paid their fines and moved on, James pushed back. He challenged their ridiculous rules. He attended meetings and questioned their decisions. And for that, Diane had made it her mission to make his life miserable. The shipping containers weren't just about community improvement. They were an escalation, a message, a warning. But James wasn't about to back. Determined to fight back, James started digging. He had already called his lawyer, Samantha, who assured him that placing shipping containers on someone's private driveway without consent was not only a violation of property rights but also a potential legal offense. But James needed more leverage. He combed through records, looking for anything that could turn the tables on the HOA. That's when he stumbled upon something shocking, something that made him lean back in his chair, exhaling in disbelief. Through his LLC, Westland Properties, James owned the very building where the HOA had its office. It had been part of a real estate investment years ago, one of several properties he had acquired through the company. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was their landlord. The HOA, which had spent months tormenting him, operated out of a space that he controlled. He checked the lease agreement. It was up for renewal in just a few weeks. A slow grin spread across his face. Diane and her cronies had no idea what was coming. Armed with his newfound leverage, James wasted no time. He attended the next HOA meeting, which, as usual, was held in the very building he owned. The conference room was filled with board members and concerned residents, many of whom had their own grievances against the HOA. Diane sat at the head of the table, her usual smug confidence on display as she called the meeting to order. James waited patiently, letting them drone on about landscaping guidelines and noise ordinances before he finally spoke. "I'd like to address something," he said, standing up. The room turned to him. Specifically, the matter of the 5 shipping containers blocking my driveway. Diane's expression barely faltered. "As we discussed, James, this is a community initiative. That's not what I'm talking about," he interrupted. He pulled out a stack of papers and placed them on the table. "I recently reviewed some property records and discovered something interesting. You see, this building, the one we're in right now, is owned by Westland Properties." Diane's confident demeanor flickered. James leaned forward. "And in case you didn't know, I own Westland Properties." The room fell silent. Richard's grip on his clipboard tightened. Karen's face went pale. Diane, for the first time, looked genuinely unsettled. James let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. "That means I'm your landlord. And I have some new terms for your lease." The silence in the room was deafening as James placed a revised lease agreement on the table. Diane hesitated before picking up the document, her eyes scanning the pages with increasing alarm. "Effective immediately," James began, his voice steady but firm, "Westland Properties is implementing new lease terms for tenants occupying this building." He gestured toward the board members. "That includes the HOA." Diane cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "James, you can't just—" "I absolutely can," he interrupted. "As your landlord, I have the right to renegotiate lease terms upon renewal, and seeing as your lease expires in a few weeks, I figured now is a good time for a few adjustments." He leaned forward, tapping the document. "The first condition, remove those shipping containers from my driveway by the end of the week. The second, no more arbitrary fines, no more harassment of homeowners. The HOA's authority ends at enforcing real, necessary community standards, not making up ridiculous rules to exert control." Richard, still gripping his clipboard like a life preserver, finally found his voice. "This is extortion," he sputtered. "Actually," Samantha, James's lawyer, chimed in from the back of the room, "this is business. Your lease is month to month, meaning Mr. Reynolds has full legal authority to terminate it or renegotiate its terms at his discretion." James allowed himself a smirk. "Which brings me to my third condition. The HOA will either reform and start working with homeowners instead of against them, or it can find a new office, somewhere far, far away." James had expected pushback from Diane and her lackeys, but what he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the story would gain traction beyond their quiet suburban neighborhood. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors, fed up with years of arbitrary rules and power-hungry enforcement, began sharing their own horror stories. A local news station caught wind of the situation and sent a reporter to cover the HOA's abuse of power. Soon, the story had gone viral. Headlines appeared on news sites and social media: "Homeowner fights back against HOA tyranny," "Landlord turns tables on power-hungry HOA," and "Man uses lease to overthrow HOA's reign of terror." Videos of James's confrontation at the meeting circulated online, racking up thousands of views. Even national news outlets picked up the story, inviting legal experts to weigh in on whether HOA overreach had finally met its match. Diane, Richard, and Karen were suddenly thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. The same neighbors they had lorded over for years were now speaking out against them, and the once untouchable HOA found itself scrambling to do damage control. But the damage had already been done. Public opinion had shifted, and James was no longer just one frustrated homeowner. He had become the face of a movement against HOA. As the HOA reeled from the media backlash, James and Samantha dug deeper into the legality of the shipping containers. Unsurprisingly, what they found only made the HOA's situation worse. "These containers violate multiple municipal codes," Samantha told him over coffee one morning. "They block emergency access routes, they weren't permitted, and they're considered a public safety hazard." James's eyebrows lifted. "You mean to tell me they broke the law and tried to fine me for a garden gnome?" Samantha smirked. "Not just that. The fire department is getting involved. Apparently, they received multiple complaints, and now the city is issuing fines for each day the containers remain in place." James chuckled, shaking his head. "So Diane's community improvement project, is about to cost the HOA a small fortune? More than that, Samantha said, setting her coffee down. If they don't remove the containers immediately, the city will remove them and bill the HOA for the cost. That was the final nail in the coffin. Within 48 hours, a crew arrived to haul away the containers, but by then, the damage was irreversible. The HOA's credibility had been shattered, and the board members knew they were running out of options. With the HOA's misdeeds exposed, the community, once silenced by fear of fines and retaliation, finally found its voice. Neighbors came together, sharing their experiences of unjust penalties, arbitrary rules, and intimidation tactics. One resident, an elderly man named George, revealed he had been fined for hanging an American flag at the wrong angle. A young couple admitted they had been cited for their non-regulation doormat. Even the local elementary school teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, had received a violation notice for excessive holiday decorations after putting up a string of Christmas lights. The neighborhood, once divided by the HOA's overreach, now stood united against it. Homeowners demanded change. They called for accountability. They wanted Diane, Richard, and Karen gone. At first, the board tried to resist, hoping the outrage would blow over. But it didn't. The media attention, the legal trouble, and now the community's fury had turned the tide against them. They were no longer in control. Faced with mounting pressure, Diane, Richard, and Karen finally caved. One by one, they submitted their resignations. Diane tried to frame it as a personal decision, citing stress and the unfair witch hunt against her. Richard claimed he was stepping down to focus on other responsibilities. Karen, to everyone's surprise, admitted she regretted how things had been handled. "I thought we were helping," she murmured at her last meeting, "but we lost sight of what really mattered." With the board dismantled, the HOA was left in disarray. A new election was called, and for the first time in years, homeowners had a say in how their community was run. The tyrannical rule of Diane and her cronies was over. James, standing at the back of the room, watched as his neighbors reclaimed their voices. He had started this fight to get 5 shipping containers removed from his driveway, but in the end, he had helped spark something bigger, a movement to take back their neighborhood. With the old HOA board dismantled, the neighborhood found itself at a crossroads. For years, residents had lived under the thumb of a group that thrived on intimidation, excessive rules, and arbitrary fines. Now, for the first time in recent memory, they had the power to shape their community in a way that actually benefited them. The energy at the next neighborhood gathering was unlike anything James had ever seen. Instead of the usual HOA meetings, where board members dictated policies and handed out punishments, this was an open discussion. People shared ideas, concerns, and hopes for the future. Without Diane's iron grip, conversations flowed freely, and for the first time, people weren't afraid to speak their minds. The neighborhood wasn't just reacting to the fall of the old regime, it was actively rebuilding itself. Homeowners suggested practical reforms, clearer rules, fairer enforcement, and an emphasis on community improvement rather than punishment. Instead of focusing on nitpicking mailbox colors and garden gnome heights, they discussed ways to make the neighborhood more welcoming, inclusive, and functional. James watched in quiet satisfaction as people who had once been strangers now worked together. It was proof that the HOA had never been about protecting the community, it had been about control. And now, the community was taking that control back. Of all the former board members, Karen's transformation was the most surprising. While Diane and Richard had vanished from neighborhood affairs, likely nursing their wounded egos, Karen stuck around. She had once been the most rigid enforcer of HOA rules, dutifully citing violations and handing out fines without question. But in the wake of the scandal, something shifted. One evening, she knocked on James's door, looking sheepish. "I owe you an apology," she said, avoiding his gaze. "I really thought we were making the neighborhood better. But I see now that we were just making people miserable." James crossed his arms, studying her. "Why the change of heart?" She sighed. "After everything happened, I started talking to people, really talking to them. I heard their stories, their frustrations, and I realized I'd been part of the problem." She looked up, her expression sincere. "I want to make things right." True to her word, Karen threw herself into community initiatives, not as an enforcer of rules, but as an active participant in making the neighborhood a better place. She helped organize neighborhood cleanups, assisted elderly residents with home maintenance, and even spearheaded a project to renovate the neglected community park. Over time, people forgave her. She had been a part of the problem, yes, but now she was dedicated to being part of the solution. The neighborhood didn't just want a new HOA board, they wanted a new system entirely. Under Diane's rule, the HOA had been a dictatorship disguised as an organization. Now, they needed something fair, transparent, and truly representative of the people. After weeks of discussions, the community voted to implement a rotating leadership system. Instead of a permanent board with unchecked power, residents would elect a group of volunteers to oversee community matters, with members rotating every year to prevent any single person or small group from hoarding control. Decision-making would be transparent, with all homeowners given a voice in major policies. No more surprise fines. No more secret meetings. No more absurd rules that benefited no one. The first order of business for the newly formed committee was simple: review and repeal outdated, unnecessary, and oppressive regulations. The mailbox color requirement? Gone. The absurd limitations on garden decorations? Scrapped. The HOA's power to impose arbitrary fines? Severely restricted. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was governed by the people who lived there, not by those who sought to control them. As the dust settled, the community found a way to turn the remnants of their conflict into something meaningful. The shipping containers, once a symbol of HOA overreach and abuse, were repurposed into something entirely new. Instead of being hauled away, the residents decided to convert them into community garden beds, a tangible representation of the neighborhood's transformation. James helped oversee the effort, watching as volunteers painted the once intimidating steel structures with bright colors and murals reflecting the diversity and vibrancy of the people who lived there. Each container became a different section of the garden, one for vegetables, one for flowers, another for a small fruit orchard. The final container was converted into a community storage shed, stocked with tools and supplies for neighborhood projects. What had once been a source of conflict had now become a space for people to connect, to contribute, and to build something lasting. It was more than just a practical repurposing of materials. It was a statement. This neighborhood belonged to the people, not to an overreaching board. And they had the power to shape it as they saw fit. The air felt different in the neighborhood now. Lighter, freer. People no longer walked on eggshells, afraid of receiving some arbitrary violation notice in their mailbox. Instead, they greeted each other warmly, worked together on projects, and took pride in their community not out of fear, but out of genuine care. James, who had once been at war with the HOA, now found himself at peace. He had never set out to lead a revolution. He had just wanted to get his driveway back. But in standing up for himself, he had helped spark something bigger. He had proven that people didn't have to accept being controlled by those who sought power for power's sake. They could push back. They could demand better. And when they stood together, they could reclaim what was rightfully theirs. One evening, as he walked past the newly built community garden, he saw Karen watering the plants, a smile on her face. Nearby, neighbors gathered to chat, kids played, and the once divided community felt whole again. James took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The fight had been worth it. The neighborhood had changed, not just in its rules and governance, but in its spirit. And as he turned toward home, he knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of something truly special.